Hello guys. In this lecture, I'm going to discuss with you about the 5 phases of project planning. The key ingredients of relaxed control are number 1, clearly defined outcomes, and the next actions required to move them toward closure. And the next thing is reminders placed in a trusted system that is reviewed regularly. This is what I call horizontal focus. Although it may seem simple, the actual application of the process can create profound results. So let me also introduce you something else. Horizontal focus is all you'll need in most situations. Most of the time, sometimes, however, you may need greater rigor and focus to get a project or situation under control. This is where you have to enhance vertical focus. Like I have said, sometimes you may need greater rigor and focus to get a project or a situation under control, just so that you would ensure all the right steps have been determined. This is where vertical focus comes in. Knowing how to think productively in this more vertical way and how to integrate the results into your personal system is the second powerful behavior set needed for any knowledge work. This kind of thinking doesn't have to be elaborate. Most of the thinking you'll need to do is informal, what I call back of the envelope planning. The kind of thing you do literally on the back of an envelope or a napkin in a coffee shop. Well, this tends to be the most productive kind of planning you can do in terms of your output, relative to the energy you put into it. True, once in a while, everyone may need to develop a more formal structure or plan to clarify components, sequences, or priorities. And more detailed outlines will also be necessary to coordinate more complex situations. If teams need to collaborate about various project pieces, for example, or if business plans need to be drafted to convince an investor, you know what you're doing. But as a general rule, you can be pretty creative with nothing more than a pen and piece of paper. The greatest need I have seen in project thinking in the professional world is not for more formal models. Usually, the people who need these models already have them or can get them as part of an academic or professional curriculum. Instead, I have found the biggest gap to be the lack of project focusing model for the rest of us. We need ways to validate and support our thinking, no matter how informal. Formal planning sessions and high horsepower planning tools can certainly be useful at times, but too often the participants in a meeting will need to have another meeting to actually get a piece of work fleshed out and under control. More formal and structured meetings also tend to skip over at least one critical issue, such as why the project is being done in the first place, or they don't allow adequate time for brainstorming, the development of a bunch of ideas nobody's ever thought about that would make the project more interesting, more profitable, or just more fun. And finally, very few such meetings bring to bear sufficient rigor in determining action steps and accountabilities for the various aspects of a project plan. The good news is there is a productive way to think about projects, situations, and topics that creates maximum value with minimal expenditure of time and effort. It happens to be the way we naturally plan when we consciously try to get a project under control or simply execute for a desired outcome. Let me discuss about natural planning model. You are already familiar with the most brilliant and creative planner in the world, brain. You yourself are actually a planning machine. You're planning when you get dressed, eat lunch, go to the store, or simply talk. Although the process may seem somewhat random, a quite complex series of steps has to occur before your brain can make anything happen physically. Your mind goes through 5 steps to accomplish virtually any task. So let me give you a clear-cut explanation of all of these things. Natural planning has different phases. Like number 1, defining your purpose and principles, outcome visioning, brainstorming, organizing, identifying next actions. So I can paint a scenario or you can do it for yourself. It is pretty much clear these are the things which we'll be doing. I'll go in depth about each of these steps and phases in natural planning model, but right now let me give you something else. Natural planning is not necessarily normal, but is the process described in the previous section the way your committee is planning the retreat? Is it how your IT team is approaching the new system installation? Is it how you're organizing the wedding or thinking through the potential merger? Have you clarified the primary purpose of the project and communicated it to everyone who ought to know it? Have you agreed on the standards and behaviors you will need to adhere to in order to make it successful? Have you envisioned success and considered all the innovative things that might result if you achieved it? Have you gotten all possible ideas out on the table? Everything you need to take into consideration that might affect the outcome? Have you identified the mission critical components, key milestones, and deliverables? Have you defined all the aspects of the project that could be moved on right now? What the next action is for each part and who is responsible for what? If you're like most people I interact with in a coaching or consulting capacity, the collective answer to these questions is probably not. There are likely to be at least some components of the natural planning model that you haven't implemented. So let me give you an understanding about the unnatural planning model. To emphasize the importance of utilizing the natural planning model for the more complex things we are involved with, let's contrast it with the more normal model used in most environments, which I would call as unnatural planning model. This is when the good idea is a bad idea. Have you ever heard a well-intentioned manager or project head start a meeting with the question, okay, so who's got a good idea about this? What is the assumption over there? Before any evaluation of what is a good idea can be trusted, the purpose must be clear, the vision must be well defined, and all the relevant data must have been collected and analyzed. So trying to approach any situation from a perspective that is not the natural way your mind operates will be difficult. People do it all the time, but it almost always engenders a lack of clarity and increased stress. In interactions with others, it opens the door for egos, politics, and hidden agendas to take over the discussion. And if it is just you attempting to come up with a good idea before defining your purpose, creating a vision, and collecting lots of initial bad ideas, it's likely to give you a case of creative constipation. Not the good idea, right? This is where the reactive planning model is what people take. The unnatural model is what most people still consciously think of as planning. Because it is so often artificial and irrelevant to real work, people just don't plan, at least not on the front end. They resist planning meetings, presentations, and strategic operations until the last minute. But what happens if you don't plan ahead of time? In many cases, it will be crisis. Then, when the urgency of the last minute is upon you, the reactive planning model ensues. What is the first level of focus when the stuff hits the fan? Action. Work harder, overtime, more people, get busier, and a lot of stressed out people are thrown at the situation. Then when having a lot of busy people banging into each other doesn't resolve the situation, someone gets more sophisticated and says, we need to get organized. Then people drop boxes around the problem and label them, or redraw the boxes and relabel them. At some point, they realize that just redrawing boxes isn't really doing much to solve the problem. Now someone suggests that more creativity is needed. Let's brainstorm. When not much happens, the boss may surmise that his staff has used up most of its internal creativity. Time to hire a consultant. Of course, if the consultant is worth his salt, at some point he's probably going to ask the big question. So what are you really trying to do here anyway? Those are the vision and the purpose. So everything falls into this natural planning technique, which is having the 5 phases. It goes without saying, but still must be said again. Thinking in more effective ways about projects and situations can make things happen sooner, better, and more successfully. So if our minds plan naturally anyway, what can we learn from that? How can we use that model to facilitate getting more and better results in our thinking? So let's examine each of the 5 phases of natural planning and see how we can leverage these contexts. It is purpose. It never hurts to ask the question why. Almost anything you're currently doing can be enhanced and even galvanized by more scrutiny at this top level of focus. Right? Why are you going to your next meeting? What is the purpose of your task? Why are you having friends over for dinner? Why are you hiring a marketing director instead of an agency? Why are you putting up with the situation in your service organization? Why do you have a budget? Ad infinitum. I admit it, this is nothing but advanced common sense. To know and to be clear about the purpose of any activity are prime directives for appropriate focus, creative development, and cooperation, but it is common sense that is not commonly practiced. Simply because it is so easy for us to create things, get caught up in the form of what we have created, and let our connection with our real and primary intentions slip. I know, based upon thousands of hours spent in many offices with many sophisticated people, that the why question cannot be ignored. When people complain to me about having too many meetings, I have to ask, what is the purpose of the meetings? When they ask, who should I invite to the planning session? I have to ask, what is the purpose of the planning session? And the dilemma is whether to stay connected with work and email on a vacation or not. I have to ask, what is the primary purpose of the vacation? Until we have the answer to my questions, there is no possible way to come up with an appropriate response. So, the value of thinking about why. Some benefits are like this, which I have outlined here. It defines success. People are starved for wins these days. We love to play games and we like to win, or at least be in a position where we could win, right? And if you're not totally clear about the purpose of what you're doing, you have no chance of winning. Purpose defines success. It is the primal reference point for any investment of time and energy, from deciding to run for elective office to designing a form. Ultimately, you cannot feel good about a staff meeting unless you know what the purpose of the meeting was. And if you want to sleep well, you would better have a good answer when your board asks why you fired your head of marketing or hired that hotshot MBA as your new finance director. You won't really know whether or not your business plan is any good until you hold it up against the success criterion that you define by answering the question, why do we need a business plan? Number 2, it creates decision-making criteria. Number 2, it creates decision-making criteria. How do you decide whether to spend the money for a 5-color brochure or just go with a 2-color? How do you know whether it's worth hiring a major web design firm to handle your new website, or how do you know if you should send your daughter to private school? It all comes down to purpose. Given what you're trying to accomplish, are these investments required? There is no way to know until the purpose is defined, right? And then it aligns resources. How should we spend our staffing allocation in the corporate budget? How do we best use the cash flow right now to maximize our viability as a retailer over the next year? Should we spend more money on the luncheon or on the speakers for the monthly association meeting? In each case, the answer depends on what we are really trying to accomplish, the why. And number 4, it motivates. Let's face it, if there is no good reason to be doing something, it is not worth doing. I'm often stunned by how many people have forgotten why they are doing what they are doing, and by how quickly a simple question like, why are you doing that, can get them back on track. And number 5, it clarifies focus. When you land on the real purpose for anything you're doing, it makes things clearer. Just taking 2 minutes and writing out your primary reason for doing something invariably creates an increased sharpness of vision, much like bringing a telescope into focus. Frequently, projects and situations that have begun to feel scattered and blurred grow clearer when someone brings it back home by asking, what are we really trying to accomplish here? And the final is, it expands options. Paradoxically, even as purpose brings things into pinpoint focus, it opens up creative thinking about wider possibilities. When you really know the underlying why for the conference, for the staff party, for your vacation, for the elimination of the management position, or for the merger, it expands your thinking about how to make the desired result happen. When people write out their purpose for a project in my seminars, they often claim it's like a fresh breeze blowing through their mind, clarifying their vision of what they're doing. Is your purpose clear and specific enough? If you're truly experiencing the benefits of a purpose, focus, motivation, clarity, decision-making criteria, alignment, and creativity, then your purpose probably is specific enough. But many purpose statements are too vague to produce such results. To have a good team, for example, might be too broad or vague a goal. After all, what constitutes a good team? Is it a group of people who are highly motivated, collaborating in healthy ways and taking initiative? Or is it a team that comes in under budget? In other words, if you don't really know when you have met your purpose or when you are off track, you don't have a viable directive. The question is, how will I know when this is off purpose? Must have a clear answer. The next thing after purpose is principles. Now let's discuss about principles. These are of equal value as prime criteria for driving and directing a project with the standards and values you hold. Although people seldom think about this consciously, they are always there. And if they are violated, the result will inevitably be unproductive, distraction, and stress. Great way to think about what your principles are is to complete this sentence. I would give others totally free rein to do this as long as they as long as they what policies stated or unstated will apply to your group's activities, as long as they stayed within budget, satisfied the client, ensured a healthy team, promoted a positive image. It can be a major source of stress when others engage in or allow behavior that is outside your standards. If you never have to deal with this issue, you are truly graced. If you do some constructive conversation about and clarification of principles could align the energy and prevent unnecessary conflict, you may want to begin by asking yourself what behavior might undermine what I'm doing and how can I prevent it. That will give you a good starting point for defining your standards. Another great reason for focusing on principles is the clarity and reference point they provide for positive conduct. How do you want or need to work with others on this project to ensure its success? What behaviors are in and out of bounds for your kids on the family vacation? You and others are at your best when you're acting how. Whereas purpose provides the juice and direction, principles define the parameters of action and the criteria for excellence of conduct. So principles are something like the standards and values you hold. Vision or outcome. In order to most productively access the conscious and unconscious resources available to you, you must have a clear picture in your mind of what success would look like, sound like, and feel like. Purpose and principles furnish the impetus and the monitoring, but vision provides the actual blueprint of the final result. This is the what instead of the why. It is simply the blueprint of the final result. What will this project or situation really be like when it successfully appears in the world? For example, graduates of your seminar are demonstrating consistently applied knowledge of the subject matter. Market share has increased to 2% within the northeastern region over the last fiscal year. Your daughter is clear about your guidelines and support for her first semester in college. It drives the power of focus. Since the 1960s, thousands of books have expounded on the value of appropriate positive imagery and focus. Forward-looking focus has even been a key element in Olympic-level sports training, with athletes imagining the physical effort, the positive energy, and the successful result to ensure the highest level of unconscious support for their performance. We know that the focus we hold in our minds affects what we perceive and how we perform. This is as true on the golf course as it is in a staff meeting or during a serious conversation with a life partner. My interest here lies in providing a model for focus that is dynamic in a practical way, especially in project thinking. When you focus on something, the vacation you're going to take, the meeting you're about to go into, the project you want to launch, that focus instantly creates ideas and thought patterns you wouldn't have had otherwise. Even your physiology will respond to an image in your head as if it were reality. Have you ever heard about the reticular activating system? Its formation is basically the gateway to your conscious awareness. It is the switch that turns on your perception of ideas and data. The thing that keeps you asleep even when music's playing but wakes you if a special little baby cries in another room. Just like a computer, your brain has a search function, but it is even more phenomenal than a computer's. It seems to be programmed by what we focus on and more primarily what we identify with. It is the seat of what many people have referred to as the paradigms we maintain. We notice only what matches our internal belief system, identified content. Optometrist, for example, you will tend to notice people with eyeglasses in the room. If you're a building contractor, you may notice the room's physical detail. If you focus on the color red right now, then just glance around your environment. If there is any red at all, you will see even the tiniest bits of implications of how this filter works, how we are unconsciously made conscious nation till a week long, if not the rest of your life. Suffice it to say that something automatic and extraordinary happens in you. Create focus on a clear picture of what you want. So, what is it? We need to clarify our outcomes. There is a simple but profound principle emerges, understanding the way your perceptive filters work. You won't see how to do it until you see yourself doing it. It is easy to envision something happening if it has happened before or you have had experience with successes. It can be quite a challenge, however, to identify with images of success. They represent new and foreign territory. That is, you have few reference points about what an event might actually look like and little experience of your own ability to make it happen. Many of us hold ourselves back from imagining a desired outcome unless someone can show us how to get there. Unfortunately, that is backward in terms of how our minds work to generate and recognize solutions and methods. One of the most powerful life skills, one of the most important to hone and develop for both professional and personal success, creating clear outcomes. This is not as self-evident as it may sound. We need to constantly define what we are trying to accomplish at many different levels, consistently reallocate resources toward getting these tasks complete as effectively and efficiently as possible. What will this project look like when it's done? How do you want the client to feel? What do you want him to know, do after the presentation? Where will you be in your career 3 years from now? How would the ideal head of finance do his job? What would your website really look like and has capabilities if it could be the way you wanted it? What would your relationship with your son feel like if this conversation you need to have with him were successful? Outcome vision can range from a simple statement of the project, such as a finalized computer system application, to a completely scripted movie depicting the future scene in all its glorious detail. When I'm able to get people to successful scenario the project, they usually experience heightened enthusiasm and think of something unique and positive about it that didn't occur to them before. Wouldn't it be great if not a bad way to start thinking about a situation, at least for long enough to have the option of getting an answer? So, what is it? Brainstorming. Once you know what you want to happen, why, the how mechanism is brought into play. When you identify with some picture in your mind that is different from your current reality, you automatically start filling in the gaps. Or brainstorming, ideas begin to pop into your head in somewhat random order. Little ones, big ones, not so good ones, good ones. This process usually goes on internally for most people about most things, and that's often sufficient. For example, you think about what you want to say to your boss as you're walking down the hall to speak to her. But there are many other instances when writing things down or capturing them in some external way can give a tremendous boost to productive output and thinking. How mechanism is brought into play. First thing is you have to do capturing your ideas. Over the past several decades, a number of graphics oriented brainstorming techniques are used to help develop creative thinking about projects and topics. They have been given names such as mind mapping, clustering, patterning, webbing, fishboning. Although the authors of these various processes portray them, most of us end users, basic premise remains the same. Give yourself permission to capture and express any idea. and then later on figure out how it fits in, what to do with it. If nothing else, this practice adds to your efficiency. When you have the idea, you grab it, which means you won't have to have the idea again. The most popular of these concepts and techniques is called mind mapping, a name coined by Tony Buzan, British researcher in brain functioning, to label this process of brainstorming ideas into a graphic format. In mind mapping, the core idea is presented in the center, with associated ideas growing out in a somewhat free-form fashion around it. For instance, if I found out that I had to move my office, I might think about computers, changing my business cards, all the connections I would have to change, new furniture, moving the phones, purging and packaging, so on. If I capture these thoughts graphically, it might start to look something like a pattern. You could do this kind of mind mapping on post-its that could be stuck on a whiteboard, or you could input ideas into a word processing program, outlining program, or one of the many mind mapping software market. Or much easier, you could do it on a paper with a pen. Now, distributed cognition. The great thing about external brainstorming is that in addition to capturing your original ideas, it can help generate many new ones that might not have occurred to you if you didn't have a mechanism to hold your thoughts, continually reflect them back to you. It is as if your mind were to say, look, I'm only going to give you as many ideas as you feel you can effectively use. If you're not collecting them in some structured way, I won't give you that many. But if you're actually doing something with the ideas, even if it is just recording them for later evaluation, then here, have a bunch. And oh wow, that reminds me of another one. And another. Psychologists have now labeled this and similar process distributed cognition. It is getting things out of your head and into objective, reviewable formats, building an extended mind. But my English teacher in high school didn't have to know about the theory to give him the key. David, he said, you're going to college and you're going to be writing papers. Write all your notes and quotes on separate 3x5-inch cards. Then, when you get ready to organize your thinking, just spread them all out on the floor, see the natural structure that emerges, and figure out what's missing. That was the teaching of a major piece of the natural planning model. Few people can hold their focus on a topic for more than a couple of minutes without some objective structure, tool or trigger to help them. Pick a big project you have going right now and just try to think of nothing else for more than 30 seconds. This is pretty hard to do unless you have a pen and paper in hand and use one of those cognitive artifacts as the anchor for your ideas. Then you can stay with it for hours. That is why good thinking can happen while you're working on a computer document about a project. Mind mapping it on a notepad, doodling about it on a paper tablecloth, or just having a meeting about it with other people in a room that allows you to hold the context. So let me give you some keys to brainstorming. Many techniques can be used to facilitate brainstorming and out-of-the-box thinking. The basic principles, however, can be summed up as follows. Don't judge, challenge, evaluate, or criticize. Number 2, let me just give you an understanding of the first point. It is easy for the unnatural planning model to rear its ugly head in brainstorming, making people jump to premature evaluations and critiques of ideas. If you care even slightly about what a critique thinks, you will censor your expressive process as you look for the right thing to say. There is a very subtle distinction between keeping brainstorming on target with the topic and stifling with the creative process. It is also important that brainstorming be put into the overall context of the planning process. Because if you think you're doing it just for its own sake, it can seem trite and inappropriately off course. If you can understand it instead as something that you're doing right now for a certain period before you move toward a resolution at the end, you will feel more comfortable giving this part of the process its due. This is not to suggest that you should shut off critical thinking though. Everything ought to be fair game at this stage. Here is what might be wrong with that approach. It needs to be on the table. If it is present, often it is the most challenging and critical ideas that have the germ of the best ones. It is just wise to understand what kinds of thoughts you're having and to park them for use in the most appropriate way. The primary criteria must be inclusion and expansion, not constriction and contraction. Number two, go for quantity, not quality. Going for quantity keeps your thinking expansive. Often you won't know what's a good idea until you have it. And sometimes you will realize it's a good idea, or the germ of one only later on. You know how shopping at a big store with lots of options lets you feel comfortable about your choice? The same holds true for project thinking. The greater the volume of thoughts you have to work with, the better the context you can create for developing options and trusting your choices. Number three, put analysis and organization in the background. Analysis and evaluation and organization of your thoughts should be given as free a rein as creative, out of the box thinking. But in the brainstorming phase, this critical activity should not be the driver. Making a list can be a creative thing to do. It is a way to consider the people who should be on your team, the customer requirements for the software, or the components of the business plan. Just make sure to grab all that and keep going until you get into the weeding and organizing of focus that make up the next stage. Now we come to organizing. If you have done a thorough job of emptying your head of all the things that came up in the brainstorming phase, you will notice that a natural organization is emerging. As my high school English teacher suggested, once you get all the ideas out of your head, you will automatically notice natural relationships and structure. This is what most people are referring to when they talk about organizing a project. Organizing usually happens when you identify components and subcomponents, sequences of events, and priorities. What are the things that must occur to create the final result? In what order must they occur? What is the most important element to ensure the success of the project? This is the stage in which you can make good use of structuring tools ranging from informal bullet points scribbled on the back of an envelope to heavy horsepower project planning software. When a project calls for substantial object to control, you will need some type of hierarchical outline with components and subcomponents, or Gantt type chart showing stages of the project laid out over time, with independent and dependent parts and milestones identified in relationship to the whole. Creative thinking doesn't stop here. It just takes another form. Once you perceive a basic structure, your mind will start trying to fill in the blanks. So identifying the three keys things that you need to handle on the project, for example, may cause you to think of a fourth and fifth when you see them all lined up. So what are the basics of organizing? Number one, identify the significant pieces. Then sort by components, sequences, priorities. The third one is detail to the required degree. I have never seen any two projects that needed to have exactly the same amount of structure and detail developed in order to get things off people's minds moving successfully. But almost all projects can use some form of creative thinking from the sequential part of the brain along the lines of what is the plan. Now you need to understand about the next actions. The final stage of planning comes down to decisions about the allocation and reallocation of physical resources to actually get the project moving. The question to ask here is, what is the next action? As we noted in the previous chapter, this kind of grounded, reality-based thinking combined with clarification of the desired outcome forms the critical component for defining and clarifying what our real work is. In my experience, creating a list of what your real projects are and consistently managing your action for each one will constitute 90% of what is generally thought of as project planning. This ground floor approach will make you honest about all kinds of things. Are you really serious about doing this? Who is responsible? Have you thought things through enough? At some point, if the project is an actionable one, this next action thinking decision must be made. Answering the question about what specifically you would do about something physically if you had nothing else to do will test the maturity of your thinking about the project. If you're not yet ready to answer that question, you have more to flesh out at some prior level in the natural planning sequence. So the first thing is decide on next actions for each of the current moving parts of the project. Then decide on the next action in the planning process if necessary. Activating the moving parts. A project is sufficiently planned for implementation when every next action step has been decided on every front. That can actually be moved on without some other components having to be completed first. If the project has multiple components, each of them should be assessed appropriately by asking, is there something that anyone could be doing on this right now? You could be coordinating speakers for the conference, for instance, at the same time that you're finding the appropriate site. More to plan. What if there is still more planning to be done before you can feel comfortable with what's next? There is still an action step. It is just a process action. What is the next step in the continuation of planning? Drafting more ideas, emailing Anna Maria and Sean to get their input, telling your assistant to set up a planning meeting with the product team. The habit of clarifying the next action on projects, no matter what the situation, is fundamental to you staying in relaxed control. When the next action is someone else's, if the next action is not yours, you must nevertheless clarify whose it is. In a group planning situation, it is not necessary for everyone to know what the next step is on every part of the project. Often, all that is required is to allocate responsibility for parts of the project to the appropriate persons and leave it up to them to identify next actions on the particular pieces. This next action conversation forces organizational clarity. Issues and details emerge that don't show up until someone holds everyone's feet to the fire about the physical level reality of resource allocation. It is a simple, practical discussion to foster, and one that can significantly stir the pot and identify weak links. How much planning do you really need to do? How much of this planning model do you really need to flesh out, and to what degree of detail? The simple answer is as much as you need to get the project off your mind. In general, the reason things are on your mind is that the outcome and action steps have not been appropriately defined, or reminders of them have not been put in places where you can be trusted to look for them appropriately. Additionally, you may not have developed the details, perspectives, and solutions sufficiently to trust the efficacy of your blueprint. Most projects, given by definition of a project as an outcome requiring more than one action, need no more than a listing of their outcome and next action for you to get them off your mind. You need a new stockbroker? Just have to call a friend for a recommendation. You want to set up a new printer at home? You just need to surf the web to check out different models and prices. I estimate that 80% of projects are of that nature. You will still be doing the full planning model on all of them, but only in your head, and just enough to figure out next actions and keep them going until they're complete. Another 15% or so of projects might require at least some external form of brainstorming, maybe a mind map or a few notes in a word processing or presentation program. That might be sufficient. A final 5% of projects might need the deliberate application of one or more of the 5 phases of the natural planning model. The model provides a practical recipe for unsticking things, resolving them, and moving them forward productively. Then, need more clarity. If greater clarity is what you need, shift your thinking up the natural planning scale. People are often very busy, but nonetheless experience confusion and a lack of clear direction. They need to pull out the plan or create one. If there is a lack of clarity at the planning level, there is probably a need for more brainstorming to generate a sufficient inventory of current ideas and data to create trust in the plan. If the brainstorming session gets bogged down with fuzzy thinking, the focus should shift back to the vision of the outcome, ensuring that the reticular filter in the brain will open up to deliver the how-to thinking. If the outcome or vision is unclear, you must return to a clean analysis of why you are engaged in the situation in the first place. Need more to be happening. If more action is what is needed, you need to move down the model. There may be enthusiasm about the purpose of a project, but at the same time some resistance to actually fleshing out what fulfilling it in the real world might look like. These days, the task of improving the quality of work life may be on the radar for a manager, but often he won't yet have defined a clear picture of the desired result. The thinking must go to the specifics of the vision. Again, ask yourself, what would the outcome look like? If you have formulated an answer to that question, but things are still stuck, it is probably time for you to grapple with some of the how issues and the operational details and perspectives. I often have clients who have inherited a relatively clearly articulated project, such as implement the new performance review system, but who aren't moving forward because they haven't yet taken a few minutes to dump some ideas out about what that entails. If brainstorming gets hung up, rigor may be required to do some evaluation of and decision making about mission critical deliverables that have to be handled. This is sometimes the case when an informal back and forth meeting that has generated lots of ideas and ends without producing any decision about what actually needs to happen next on the project. And if there is a plan, but the rubber still isn't hitting the road like it should, someone needs to assess each component with the focus of what is the next action. Who's got it? One manager who had taken over responsibility many months in advance for organizing a major annual conference asked me how to prevent the crisis all-nighters her team had experienced near the deadline of the previous year. When she produced an outline of the various pieces of the project she had inherited, which pieces could actually be moved on right now. After identifying half a dozen, we clarified the next action on each one. It was off and running in time to prevent a repeat of the previous year's last-minute chaos. In the prior two chapters, I covered the basic models of how to stay maximally productive and in control with minimal effort. At the two most basic levels of our life and work, the actions we take and the projects we enter into that generate many of those actions. The fundamentals remain true. You must be responsible for collecting all your open loops, applying a front-end thought process to each of them, and managing the results with organization, review, and action. For all those situations that you have any level of commitment to complete, there is a natural planning process that occurs to get you from here to there. Leveraging that 5-phase model can often make the evolution easier, faster, and more productive. These models are simple to understand and easy to implement.